The new Nvidia GTX 1660 Ti and older GTX 1070 are both good gaming graphics cards, but which should you pick, and is it worth upgrading? In this video, we'll test out and compare 16 different games at 1080p, 1440p, and 4K resolutions to help you see the performance difference between them and find out which is better value for the price. Let's quickly take a look at how the GTX 1660 Ti and 1070 actually differ in terms of specs. Note that things like clock speed and power will vary between specific cards. These are just the reference specs for each model. The 1070 has more CUDA cores and only just slightly higher base clock speed, while the boost clock on the 1660 Ti is higher. The 1070 also has more memory, but it's GDDR5 with different speed. For the testing, I'm using the MSI GTX 1660 Ti Gaming X and the Galax GTX 1070EX. So both cards are factory overclocked out of the box, which will slightly affect frame rates, so expect slightly different results with different cards. The system that I'm testing with has an Intel i7-8700K CPU overclocked to 5.0 GHz in an MSI Z390 Gaming Pro Carbon motherboard, along with 16GB of T-Force Nighthawk CL16 memory from Team Group, running at DDR4 3200 and dual channel. Check the links in the description for details on all of the components, as well as for up-to-date pricing. The same Windows updates and Nvidia driver 419.35 was used for the testing, so let's get into the results. Let's start off with Apex Legends, which was tested with all settings maxed out. In all upcoming graphs, I've got the GTX 1070 shown by the top bar in red, while the GTX 1660 Ti is shown below in purple, while the three different resolutions, 1080p, 1440p, and 4K are shown on the left. In terms of average FPS, the 1660 Ti was about 3% slower than the 1070 at 1080p, while the 1660 Ti takes the lead at 1440p and 4K, coming out 6.5% and 15% faster respectively. Assassin's Creed Odyssey was tested with the built-in benchmark using high settings, and the 1660 Ti was ahead at all resolutions in this game. At 1080p, it was 3% ahead of the 1070, 7% ahead at 1440p, and then almost 9% ahead at 4K, with larger improvements to 1% low also seen as we step up the resolution. Battlefield 5 was tested in campaign mode rather than multiplayer, as it's easier to consistently reproduce the test run. Both cards were providing a playable experience at 1080p and 1440p resolutions, with the 1660 Ti 5% ahead of the 1070 at 1080p, and 6% ahead at 1440p. At 4K, things change, with the 1660 Ti now 10% behind the 1070, with the 1% low from the 1070 actually above the average frame rate of the 1660 Ti. Although this doesn't practically matter given 30 FPS for a first-person shooter isn't a fun time. Far Cry New Dawn was tested using the built-in benchmark with high settings, and there was basically no difference between the two when it came to average frame rates. The 1% lows are a different story though, with the 1660 Ti consistently delivering higher results, as the 1070 was dipping more in this test. Far Cry 5 was also tested using the built-in benchmark with high settings, and this game was seeing higher FPS over the newer Far Cry New Dawn just shown. The average frame rates were also very close together in this game, regardless of graphics card used. However, this time the 1% lows were much closer together. Fortnite was tested using the replay feature, with the exact same replay on both graphics cards. In this test, the 1070 was coming out ahead of the 1660 Ti at all resolutions, both in average FPS and for 1% low. At 1080p, the 1070 was 6% ahead in terms of average FPS, 11% at 1440p, and then 17% at 4K, where it was noticeably smoother at 4K on the 1070, but no noticeable difference at lower resolutions. Metro Exodus was tested with the built-in benchmark at high settings. The actual game performs a fair bit ahead of this, so this is more of a synthetic test rather than representative of actual gameplay, but it does allow me to accurately compare between the two graphics cards, as it performs the same test run on each with very little variance. With that in mind, the 1070 was again coming out ahead of the 1660 Ti in all tests here, with a 4% lead in average FPS at both 1080p and 1440p, then just 3% at 4K. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was also tested using the built-in benchmark with high settings. This seems to be more of a graphically intensive test, and the 1660 Ti was coming out ahead at all three resolutions. At 1080p, the 1660 Ti was 3% ahead of the 1070, 5% ahead at 1440p, and then 6% ahead at 4K. Rainbow Six Siege was tested using the built-in benchmark at high settings. with a 50% render scale and TAA in use, as these were the default with the presets. This is a game that I found to prefer Nvidia's new Turing architecture, so it was no surprise to me to see the 1660 Ti coming out ahead here. At 1080p, we're looking at a 13% improvement to average FPS with the 1660 Ti, 12% at 1440p, and 9% at 4K. There were also very nice improvements to 1% lows at lower resolutions too, up to a 27% increase with the 1660 Ti at 1080p. CSGO was tested with the Electrical FPS benchmark, and both cards were delivering very high frame rates. The 1070 was coming out ahead of the 1660 Ti in all resolutions at this test, with 6% higher average FPS at 1080p, 7% at 1440p, and 15% at 4K. Overwatch was tested in the practice range, as I can easily perform the same test compared to playing with bots or other players, which will differ every time. While both of these graphics cards were capable of delivering a playable 4K experience, even with ultra settings, the 1070 was consistently ahead in this game. At 1080p, the 1070 was 7.5% ahead of the 1660 Ti in average FPS, 7.8% at 1440p, then 9.5% at 4K. PUBG was tested using the replay feature, with the exact same replay at high settings. This was another game where 1440p with good settings was quite playable, but I wouldn't want to step up higher to 4K with either. The 1660 Ti was coming out ahead in average FPS at all resolutions tested, however it was quite close. At 1080p, the 1070 was actually seeing 12% higher 1% lows, which I'd argue is more beneficial over the 2 FPS difference to the average, given both are already over 100 FPS. However, this changed at 1440p, with the 1080 Ti now 18% ahead and 1% low. Watch Dogs 2 was a resource-intensive game and was tested with high settings. In my opinion, this one doesn't need a high frame rate to play. I can get by with a solid 30 FPS. So both cards were actually giving me a playable experience at 4K. At all resolutions though, there was basically no noticeable difference between the two. Ghost Recon was tested with the built-in benchmark and high settings in use, and is another resource-heavy game. The 1070 was just slightly ahead of the 1660 Ti here, but only by a small amount, just 0.9% at 1080p and 1440p, then 4.7% at 4K. The Witcher 3 was tested with Hairworks disabled, and like most other games, was playable at both 1080p and 1440p, even with high settings in use. The 1660 Ti was coming out ahead in all three resolutions. However, it was a close match, with the 1070 not far behind, with no real practical difference between the two. Shadow of War was tested using the built-in benchmark with high settings, and is another game that I found to favour Nvidia's new Turing architecture. In this case, it doesn't really seem to be making much of a difference though, with the 1660 Ti 1% ahead at 1080p, 3.6% ahead at 1440p, and 2.4% at 4K. In terms of overall improvement, over all 16 games tested with a 1080p resolution, on average the GTX 1660 Ti was performing just 0.5% better when compared with the GTX 1070 in terms of average FPS. There wasn't really that big of a gain on the 1660 Ti, other than from the games that really seemed to favour the Turing architecture, like Rainbow Six Siege. At 1440p, on average over the same 16 games, the GTX 1660 Ti was now scoring 0.9% higher average frame rates when compared with the GTX 1070, so only a very small change on average from what we saw at 1080p. Again, we only seem to be in the positive for the 1660 Ti due to Rainbow Six Siege. At 4K, we're now seeing the scales tip towards the 1070, with more games performing better with it compared to the 1660 Ti. Perhaps due to the larger memory of the 1070, which becomes more useful at these higher resolutions. Realistically though, neither of these are 4K cards. When it comes down to it, I don't think there's very much of a performance difference between these two graphics cards. They're quite similar once we average things out, but it does of course depend on the game. It's also worth noting that the GTX 1070 does have SLI support, while the 1660 Ti does not. So technically you could expand 1070 with a second card to improve performance. However, considering how hit or miss SLI support is in games, I wouldn't consider that as an upgrade path, and would instead recommend the best single slot card you can get at the time. I haven't tested overclocking here, as results aren't guaranteed and will vary between hardware based on what overclocks you can get. Realistically, it generally only makes a couple of FPS difference, but I will cover overclocking in the full review videos. Now for the final difference, the price. I suggest checking updated prices using the links in the description, as prices will change over time. At the time of recording, in the US, my GTX 1660 Ti I'm testing with is $310 US. I am using a higher end 1660 Ti however. It just happened to be a good deal for me here in Australia when I bought it. Lower end models can be had for around $280 though. As for the GTX 1070, well, prices are a bit sad there. They seem to be around $450 US new minimum on Newegg. Many stores are already no longer even stocking the GTX 1070 as supply starts to dry up. This will likely mean that over time, the price will continue to go up further as they become difficult to buy new. As a result, the second-hand market will eventually become the only practical option, if not already, which completely changes the value proposition. I got my 1070 second-hand for about $220 US in October 2018, for example. Looking at brand new prices, I think the 1660 Ti is the clear winner. Simply because it's only just launched, it's much more widely available. And as we've seen here, it is capable of similar levels of performance on average. Though it does of course vary by game. Although it is possible that in future, the extra memory of the 1070 may be more beneficial. If you don't mind getting brand new with a warranty, then look for a second-hand 1070. There's great value there. If we plug the numbers in, I spent $220 US on my 1070 and $310 US on my 1660 Ti. So I've spent 40% more money on the 1660 Ti. If I got a cheaper $280 1660 Ti instead, then I'm still paying 27% more money over the used 1070. But this is of course only the difference in graphics cards. When you factor in the whole price of a system, the percentage value is much less. Basically, if I was buying new today, I'd just go with the 1660 Ti and get the warranty. But if you're on a tight budget and want to save some money, try and find a used 1070. Otherwise, if you're looking to upgrade and already have a 1070, well, it makes no sense to go a 1660 Ti. I'd be looking at something higher. Let me know which card you'd pick down in the comments and why. The newer GTX 1660 Ti or older GTX 1070. And don't forget to subscribe for more comparisons and future tech videos like this one.